Hi, welcome back to Chapter 10 of Business and Finance. We spent the last recording, the first part of Chapter 10, just discussing mainly regulation of professions in general. This recording is going to look at the accounting profession in more detail. So you can see here that starting at section 4 here, we've got three main groups involved in the regulation of the accounting profession in the UK. And we'll go through these in turn. So we've got the government, we've got self-regulation by the accountancy profession, and we spoke about self-regulation in the previous recording. And then we've got the oversight mechanism. So we saw how important having an oversight mechanism was when you have this level of self-regulation. So we'll go through those in turn. We'll go through those, and we'll start thinking about disciplinary procedures. And then we'll finish up for that chapter. Okay, so in terms of what the government does for regulation of the accounting profession, it's responsible for legislative elements. So think about the fact that the government's able to to enforce laws or to create laws. And to help the government to do this, the FRC acted as an advisor. Once the initial framework had been put in place, then the government decided that actually the FRC were in a much better place and delegated certain of the statutory powers that the government held to the FRC. Okay, as I said, we discussed self-regulation in the last chapter, but here we get to see exactly what we mean for the accountancy profession. And we can see here the professional accountancy bodies are responsible themselves for ensuring that their members act in the correct way. So they're making sure they're acting in a professional capacity to maintain standards and the professional standings of accountancy. So making sure that their own members, are not doing anything that will bring the name of an accountant into question. And this is a very clever way of regulating a profession, because it puts all of the onus on the bodies themselves, and if the body is seen not to be performing that role, then obviously the government or the FRC can take action to correct that. And we've got a few examples here of what the ICAW do in terms of their members. So obviously we've seen already a few entry and education requirements. So we know, for example, that you guys have to pass your professional exams. We know that in order to engage in public practice, you have to obtain a practicing certificate. Dealing with professional misconduct, we'll see a bit later. Eligibility for the performance of reserved activities. So, for example, we saw earlier that there are 4 reserved activities, including audit and insolvency. Oops. And as I said, we're going to think about those kind of conduct requirements towards the end of the chapter. That last bullet point looks, unfortunately, as it's just a repetition of an earlier one. Okay, so we've got the government's legislative powers, we've got self-regulation by the accounting bodies themselves, and we know already that self-regulation only works at its best when it has this oversight. So the FRC is responsible for the oversight mechanism of this process. And specifically for accounting and audit, we have 3 main roles. So over the page, we've got those 3 main roles listed out. Okay, and you could certainly be asked a multiple choice question here of what their roles are. So what's key? They have non-statutory oversight of the professional accounting bodies. However, they have statutory oversight of the regulation of statutory auditors. And this difference here, statutory and non-statutory, we're just referring to a legal authority. So, for example, with the audit profession, the FRC has the power to recognise and de-recognise accountancy bodies in terms of acting as a supervisory body to audit, whereas they don't have that power for the professional accountancy bodies. Finally, then we've got independent monitoring of the quality of the auditing function. So the FRC has an audit quality review, and this essentially monitors the quality of the audit work of UK audit firms that audit public interest entities, and the aim is continuous improvement in the quality of UK audit work, essentially. Okay, section 5 is just a quick section here talking about regulation of the financial services industry. So, for example, you think about who regulates the banks. And really, they talk here about who does it. So it's the Prudential Regulation Authority and the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, and they just highlight here that the accounting profession, which is obviously what we're looking at, only really affected if the firm that we're looking at, so the firm within the financial services, acts as an investment business, which we know is one of the ICAW's reserved areas, or if it's a FTSE 350 company, because there are certain listing rules that the Financial Conduct Authority insists that these FTSE 350, so the top 350 companies, adhere to or comply with. Okay. So we're going to move on to disciplinary procedures. So the disciplinary procedures, if you were to have a look in your study manual, you'll see that the disciplinary procedures that we're going to look at are very detailed and they're very lengthy. What I've tried to do here, which we'll see on the next page, is give you a bit of a flow diagram of how the process works. Now, you could certainly be asked a question or questions in the exam around this process, and obviously if you have any problems with the questions that you see in your question bank, just obviously send me over an email and we can discuss that. But hopefully the flow diagram will make things a bit simpler. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is look at the ICAW's role in disciplinary procedures. So essentially there are two levels. So if there's a complaint made against a member of ICAW, in the first instance, ICAW will review that. Now, just to point out, I know we're skipping ahead slightly, but just to point out in the last paragraph here before we hit 6.1.1, if the complaint is very serious and it's something that's already in the public domain, or may affect the reputation of the accountancy profession as a whole, then it may be that complaint is referred directly to the FRC's Conduct Division, which we're going to see at the end of the chapter. So the flow diagram we're going to see on the next page is to do with the ICAW process, and then on the final page of the chapter we look at that FRC Conduct Division process. So just to point out, that's the kind of level of severity we're dealing with. Okay, so the department that we're concerned with here for discipline is called the Professional Standards Department, and that's responsible for this disciplinary process that we're about to see. Now, why do complaints come up? Or for a variety of reasons. It could be that a member of the ICAW has breached a regulation. It could be that they've departed from guidance in some way, or it could be because they've brought discredit on ICAW. So not necessarily something relating directly to their role as an accountant. And in terms of who can make that complaint, basically anybody. Okay, so we've got a few examples here of the common people that may make a complaint. So clients, other accountants, and so on. So basically anybody. Okay, so let's say that we've had a complaint, and we'll work our way through that process. So the first step we call conciliation, and this is where we tried to come up with a good, easy, practical solution. So it might be a case of an explanation of an action. So perhaps a client has complained, made a complaint about a member, and an easy explanation is made to just explain what's happened and how why we've acted in that way. That might be enough then to resolve the problem, in which case we don't need to go any further. However, if the complaint is a bit more serious, we then move into the investigation phase. Okay, again we're going to see this. We're going to see this in the flow diagram to follow, but just to talk through the narrative to start with, this investigation process then is carried out by the investigation committee, or the IC, which we'll refer to. Depending on the outcome of the investigation then, it may be that we need to move on to some sort of disciplinary proceedings, and this is where we bring in the disciplinary committee. Again, depending on the outcome of that, you might find that there's grounds for an appeal, and we'll talk about how that works as well. Okay, so here's the flow diagram that will hopefully help us navigate through this fairly wordy and dry topic. Okay, so a client has made a complaint about a member. The first thing that we do, or the first thing that the that the ICAW will do is they'll write to the member and detail what's happened. And now the member has to answer any questions that are asked at this point, and they also must provide any information that's required for the investigation or that's been requested by the ICAW. Now, if they refuse to do that, that's a breach of a bylaw. They can be disciplined for that action in itself. So it's no good just ignoring the letter, or it's no good just saying, actually, no, I refuse to provide any information to kind of argue this case. Okay, once they've had comments, once they've had the required answers back, once they've had any further paperwork or information, the ICAW will then decide whether or not there's still a case to be answered. So it might be that after the initial investigation or after the initial query, there's an easy explanation and actually there's no further action to take. Let's assume that's not the case. If there is a case to answer, then that will be moved on to the case manager or a case manager within the investigations committee. A bit of detail on the right here. So the investigations committee consists of at least 14 people, of whom at least 25% are not chartered accountants. And this just gives a bit of balance to the process. You don't necessarily want everybody to be a chartered accountant. You need a bit more of a wide perspective. Okay, once that investigation has been completed, then we then decide whether or not there's a case to answer and whether or not we need to move on to some sort of penalty or disciplinary action. If there is a case to answer, then we move on to one of my 4 options below. If there's no case to answer, we just close the case at that point. Okay, so what are our 4 options? We can take no further action. This is still recorded, okay? So this is why it's slightly different from closing the case, because the fact that it remains, on record. You can invite the member to accept an unpublicised caution, and this is just where there'll be some sort of fine or some sort of financial penalty, but it's not made public, which is obviously great for the member or for the firm. However, does still remain recorded. Okay, so it's not made public, but it is still recorded on the member's record. Now, if the member was to decide not to pay the fine and refuse to pay, that brings us on to section 3. Now, the investigations committee might decide to go straight to option 3 here and refer the complaint to the disciplinary committee if it's something maybe a bit more serious. And as I said, if you were to offer an unpublicised caution and it was refused, we'd also then move on to 3. I'm actually going to just look at option 4 here before we look at 3, because obviously 3 has a bit more detail. Option 4 here is we could invite the member to consent to an order. So this is where we've got a problem. There's a case to answer, but it's not serious enough, for example, to exclude the member from membership or to suspend a practicing certificate or anything like that. So they offer a consent order. And again, this could be a fine, could be a financial penalty. And the difference between this and my unpublicised caution is to do with publicity. So any action involving a consent to an order has the same publicity as a disciplinary committee action. So unfortunately for the member or the firm, that's obviously going to be a matter of public knowledge, and you can see that detail over here. So consent orders and orders of the disciplinary committee and the appeals committee are sent to ICAW's magazine Economia and are published on the ICAW's website. Okay, let's have a look in a bit more detail then at a disciplinary committee hearing. So it's a tribunal, 3 people, 2 of which are chartered accountants, 1 non-accountant, again, just to provide some sort of balance there. They're held in public unless the tribunal agrees to hold in private. So the main reason that as a member or a firm you would not want this disciplinary committee hearing is the fact that it's made public. So it's obviously very damaging, or could be very damaging to the member or firm. There's a legal assessor. The legal assessor will give advice to the disciplinary committee, but they're not involved in taking decisions. And this would just be an independent solicitor or a barrister. The member can attend the hearing and they can be represented by a barrister, a solicitor or a member of ICAW. And the outcome can be reprimands, it can be fine, it can be more serious, it can be removal of practicing certificate, exclusion from ICAW. So this is where you're going to see, you know, the big penalties handed out. Now, if you were to receive an order of the disciplinary committee, so for example, let's say you've been excluded from ICAW, you have the right to appeal them. So we move down to the appeals process, and this is where your case can be heard by the appeal committee. Sounds like a detail you don't need to know, but just in case, they must do that in writing within 28 days of the disciplinary committee's decision. Okay. So the appeal committee consists of 5 people, 3 chartered accountants, 1 non-accountant member, again for balance, and a chairman who holds a legal qualification. So obviously excluding somebody from ICAW or removing a practicing certificate is a very serious matter, and the appeal committee, as the disciplinary committee had, really needs to make sure they have the legal know-how in order to kind of navigate this difficult situation. If the appeal is successful, the appeals committee will overturn the disciplinary committee decision, and because the appeal is successful, the ICAW might have to pay costs. If it's unsuccessful, the appeals committee may then order the member to pay the additional costs instead, which makes sense, I think. Okay, so that is the ICAW's process. And just to finish the chapter, then we're going to have a look at the FRC's process. Just to remind you then, we said way back here that if the complaint is something very serious and it's something that's in the public domain already, and it affects the reputation of the accountancy profession as a whole, we might bypass this ICAW process and go straight to the FRC's accountancy scheme. Okay, so the FRC essentially has, through the accountancy scheme, they have the power to investigate and to discipline accountancy bodies. So, for example, ICAW, ACCA, CIMA, and so on. So they're responsible for the members of those bodies. And as I said, it's really issues that relate to serious public concern or to damage public confidence in the accountancy profession, some sort of large fraud, for example. Now, it's essential that the FRC is an adequate oversight, and in order to be an adequate oversight, we say it must be transparent, independent, and fair. So, for example, transparency is shown in the fact that all hearings are open to the public, or normally open to the public. So nothing to hide there. Independent, we make sure that the majority of the members of the accountancy scheme, plus the chairman, essentially, crucially, are non-accountants. Okay, so again, just making sure we have that balance. And then finally, fair. Anybody who's under investigation by the accountancy scheme, for example, it is allowed access to legal representation, and also allowed access to any documentation that's relevant to the investigation. Oops. Okay, so legal representation for those under investigation. Okay, again, we've got a bit of a flow diagram here, a slightly smaller one for the FRC process, just to help us navigate our way through that process. Okay, so the professional discipline team within the conduct division will refer the case to the executive council, which is just a part of the FRC. And the executive council can do things like they have the power to request any documents. Oops. They can seek information from accountancy firms, from accountants. They can require accountancy firms to give evidence. So they have a reasonable amount of power in this scenario. They will conduct their preliminary activities then, or inquiries, and then they will decide whether or not there should be any disciplinary proceedings. If there are going to be disciplinary proceedings based on the Executive Council's investigation, they will forward that on then to the FRC's Conduct Committee. The Conduct Committee then will form a disciplinary tribunal. We don't often actually call it a committee. It's a disciplinary tribunal is the correct term. And again, that will have a majority consisting of non-accountants, again for balance. And this is where you can then start to dish out fines. Obviously, with something of this importance, we then need to ensure that there is there's an appeal process. And again, you can do that by having your case heard at an appeals trial. This process, in fact, will include, for example, a retired judge or a senior barrister considering the appeal even before it gets to that appeals tribunal. Okay, so that's the ICAW disciplinary process. That's the FRC's accountancy scheme disciplinary process. That's the end of chapter 10. Coming up next then in chapter 11, we'll start to think about corporate governance and we'll start to think about corporate responsibility. Thank you.